So this lecture will talk about the difference between capitalism and socialism and provide some of the basic arguments that are often given for capitalism. Capitalism gets its name from capital. Capital is what we call excess wealth. If you have money left over, you can use that to invest in buildings, machines, and things that will allow you to be more productive in the future and that will make work more efficient. So capital is excess wealth that can be used to buy and create improved means of production, ways of creating more wealth and more products. So the classic statement of capitalism was given by the 18th century philosopher Adam Smith, the Scottish philosopher. And he made the argument that if we allow the accumulation of capital and the investment of it in machines and factories that will specialize in labor, that it will so increase the productivity of labor that goods will become so much more cheap that everyone will benefit. So Adam Smith gave a famous example in his book, The Wealth of Nations, where he compared how people used to make pins before the existence of a factory. One man would require an entire day to make 10 pins. But if you had a factory where there was specialization of labor, where somebody did different parts of the process, somebody drawing out the wire and cutting it and doing the other things, and eventually added other improvements like machines that would do the work. One person could produce almost 5,000 pins per day, and of course that would decrease the price of those pins exponentially. So if we allow capital to accumulate and we allow for free competition and free trade between nations, people will compete and use their capital to innovate their means of production to make it more and more efficient, which means it will cost less and less for all of the goods and services that we provide. So what makes you wealthy is how much your money or how much your labor can buy. So even if you were to lose your job to somebody in China, even if you were to not be able to get a good income, you might be much better off in a capitalist form of economic system because things would be so much cheaper than they would otherwise. And we can see that the standard of living has increased steadily as the Industrial Revolution happened and as capitalism progressed. So the poorest person now has a much higher standard of living because clothes and cars and television sets and foodstuffs have become much, much cheaper, so that now the poorest person has better clothing, better food, and more reliable services than even the richest person would have had in 1600. So despite the fact that capitalism allows for unequal allocations of money, because it needs to accumulate capital or excess wealth to invest in the production of more efficient means of production. Free competition and trade will cause a competition that will produce the most efficient means of production and the best prices, which will make everything more cheap and everybody more wealthy because they can buy more. So sometimes Smith's argument was called the invisible hand, and that was because even though everyone is just out for their self-interest, trying to make as much money as possible, they'll do so by trying to make more goods more cheaply and to sell them and beat out their competitors. So the invisible hand was the way in which that system of people blindly following their own self-interest would eventually give rise to the common good, would give rise to the best and most efficient ways of producing goods and the lowest prices, making everybody more wealthy, even though no one was in fact directing it. It acted as if there were an invisible hand guiding the system of the economy towards uh, the common good. You can watch the video in the following slide describing Adam Smith's theory of the invisible hand. The system of capitalism that exists today are probably nothing like the laissez-faire versions of capitalism that Adam Smith defended. Laissez-faire means leave it alone, have unrestricted trade, unrestricted business. Um, there were lots of basic problems with capitalism that led to the requirement that in some ways or other, completely free buying and selling and production had to be modified. One of the basic problems that led to the contemporary forms of capitalism is called the business cycle. It was found that in the early days of capitalism, there would be booms and expansions, and then there would be busts, a depression that followed. And people thought that was due to the business cycle, that people would get efficient factories and they would produce more and more goods until the stockpiles and inventories built up until people couldn't keep up with them and people would stop buying them, in which case the factories would have to slow down or sometimes even close down. And when that happened, of course, the workers would have to be sent home to wait for the inventories to go down. But of course, when the workers were sent home, they no longer had any money to buy all of those products in the inventories. So you had sort of a vicious circle. In a depression, the poorer people were, the less they could buy. The less they could buy, the less businesses could employ workers because no one was buying their inventories. And it was seen that this cycle was built into the very structure of capitalism, in some ways like the prisoner's dilemma or the tragedy of the commons. So John Maynard Keynes gave it the name to the basic idea behind the solution to that problem called Keynesian economics. In Keynesian economics, the government helps to manage the economy by injecting money into the economy in the form of government jobs or government spending, or sometimes lowering interest rates, or sometimes just injecting money into the system through a Federal Reserve System. So our government has a Federal Reserve Bank that helps to regulate the economy and prevent inflation and recessions and depressions. So most modern capitalistic societies have this government-managed economy that tries to modify the supply of money and the basic interest rate that banks can charge through some government intervention. Um, One of the basic procedural arguments for capitalism has utilitarian arguments. The invisible hand says that um, allowing capital to accumulate will make everyone better off and produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number. But Robert Nozick, the Harvard philosopher, is responsible for a contemporary version of the basic libertarian argument that we saw in Thomas Hobbes. And that was that there is no morality apart from voluntary agreements. Um, and his book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, is one of the philosophical foundations of modern libertarian theory. And he gives two different examples that were talked about in the reading that we had for today. One is the one that we've mentioned before about the person who has the only water supply for 50 miles in the desert and is therefore able to charge whatever he wants because people really need the water badly. And the other example he gives is of Wilt Chamberlain. You may not have heard of Wilt Chamberlain. Think of LeBron James. Wilt Chamberlain was like the best basketball player of the 1960s. Um, so Will Chamberlain became much, much richer than doctors and famous writers and people who we might think were more objectively important to society than a basketball player. But because everyone was willing to voluntarily hand over, their $20 or whatever it is to watch him play, or were willing to watch him on TV, um, that inequality of income was allowed to build up through these free and voluntary agreements. So Nozick is going to argue, and many of the contemporary proponents of capitalism will also argue, that the most basic value is liberty, and that you shouldn't be able to restrict our right to liberty by telling us how we have to spend our money, what voluntary agreements we can enter into, what prices we have to charge. Apart from the voluntary agreement of supply and demand that determines what prices are and what we can charge and how much money we can accumulate. So there were uh, other problems with capitalism that led other types of restrictions to be put in place. Um, so since Smith's argument depended upon there being free and open competition, so that the best and most effective means of production could be produced to make us all more wealthy. The invisible hand requires that free and open competition. But of course, corporations and self interested parties aimed at circumventing that free market and establishing monopolies where they put out of business all of their competitors. And once they put their competitors out of business, they can set any prices they choose. They no longer have to make good products because they're the only supplier. And they no longer have any uh, incentive to create new and more effective means of production, which Smith saw was essential to making the best product and the best arrangement of resources possible. So most modern governments have antitrust regulations. A trust is another name for a monopoly that regulates and prevents companies from gobbling up all of their competitors and taking on too much of any competitive market. So there's antitrust legislation against Google, against General Electric or AT&T in the past. Have been examples of companies that got too big and started to establish monopolies. The other part of every contemporary capitalist society is having a labor movement, unions, since the decisions that would regulate price of labor and price of product are supposed to be free and voluntary. Some people have criticized the idea of Nozick, suggesting that if you're dying of thirst in the desert, is your choice to pay as much money as you have really voluntary if you're in fear of death. Um, so, in the same way, an individual worker who has to work in order to eat um, doesn't have enough leverage to make a fair and voluntary negotiation with employers for benefits. So, um, if they band together into a union, then because they can go on strike and prevent anybody from working, they have a more equal place in the negotiation, which means that the employers now have to make free and voluntary agreements with them on a more level playing field. So almost all capitalist nations have some form of unions and some sort of fair labor protections. So more recently, we can see that the very nature of capitalism has changed. In our last recession, caused by the subprime mortgage crisis, revealed the ways in which that gave us different vulnerabilities than the original ones that afflicted the business cycle. So if you were had a way of making profit, if you had a way of making money, it would be to your interest not just to make as much of that product as possible. Just as if I knew that one of the races at the horse betting place was rigged and I had a sure bet that would win 10 to 1, not only would I bet all of my money, I would borrow from my friends and go to the bank and get a loan because if I got a 10 to 1 payback, I'd not only be able to pay back the loan, but I'd be able to keep all of the extra profit as well. Um, so almost all modern businesses not only have capital, their own excess wealth, they borrow from banks and various different types of investments so that they can expand their business as fast as possible. And most um, capitalist enterprises involve an ideal of continual growth, continual borrowing, and continual growth. So when um, the banks that lend that money to them um, lost much of their money in the crisis because of various different bursting of bubbles, speculation bubbles, and investing bubbles, the supply of all of that capital that they need to borrow each day and each month disappeared, and companies couldn't make their payrolls. And of course, that would have led to more um, uh, people being unable to buy goods and more slowdown in the economy. So the fact that our capitalist system now runs on debt or runs on leveraging, on if you have a good business model, you're not just going to open one restaurant, you're going to open a chain of restaurants and borrow all the money you need. In some ways, it works like a pyramid scheme because you're assuming that all of your debts will be capable of being paid off um, as long as those subsidiaries that you start, those investments that you make, pay off. Um, and oftentimes, the workings of capitalism require getting more and more investors. And when the bubble bursts, or when the value of certain of those investments shrinks, the supply of money dries up and makes the entire machine impossible to run. Another difference that we'll see Marx talking about in the next lecture is the way in which capitalism now functions not just by producing different means of production, but also by producing different means of branding and marketing and selling. Capitalism today is almost more about advertising and brands and images than it is about products, or as Smith thought that um, competition would produce the best products. Now competition works in terms of brands and advertising, and sometimes what you buy is not the best product, but the product that has the most recognizable brand or the best advertising. So there are two main arguments then for capitalism. Capitalism is supposed to create so much productivity that it will make everyone better off, even the poor and those displaced by competition. That's the utilitarian argument. And then there's a libertarian argument, which says that the only moral obligations are those incurred by voluntary agreements, and that modern capitalism is based upon free and voluntary agreements, supply and demand and purchasing. And any attempt to restrict those or modify them, even to regulate them in the ways that we've mentioned, to prevent bad results that aren't consistent with the common good, they would think is a violation of their right to liberty. That if we let the markets alone, um, that will preserve that liberty, and it will also produce such great wealth that the boats of everyone will be raised on that overall rising tide. So let's look at some meanings of socialism and communism as opposed to capitalism. We're going to look at Marx's arguments for a form of socialism in the next lecture. We're reading an introduction to some very basic economic concepts about communism and socialism by George Bernard Shaw, who, of course, is much better known as a famous writer and playwright. He wrote Pygmalion, on which My Fair Lady was based, along with other famous plays. He defines communism as just having goods and services kept in common. Your family might work communistically if your father and mother put all of their wages together and then take whatever they need from the common store of food and materials that you buy. Um, Shaw identifies the sources of communism with the uh, ideas of the apostles who kept all their wealth in common, and Saint Benedict, who had the original version of Marx's dictum that we should take from each what they can provide, and to provide to each what they need, from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. Whereas he defines socialism in a very different way than some other people would. He talks about it as a way of distributing wealth. He thinks that socialism just means an equal distribution of wealth as opposed to all the other possible alternatives. So the first point that Shaw makes about wealth is that it constantly has to be distributed. Um, that sometimes we get confused by the fact that we have money and durable goods like gold and things like that that make people rich and allow them to have permanent and safe wealth or riches. But really, all the things that you really need to live, like food and shelter and clothing, they eventually wear out, and some of it very quickly. Every year, you need new food. There has to be a new harvest. If there were no harvest, no matter how rich you were, we wouldn't eat. And we can see in cases of great social unrest and need that your gold doesn't buy you anything, and money will become meaningless as well. That really the wealth that keeps us alive, that we have to worry about distributing, is the food and clothing and shelter that has to be constantly produced, which means someone has to do it and someone gets to have it. And Shaw says it has to be distributed. And if you don't make up your mind about how you want it to be distributed, someone will distribute it for you. And money, what we call money, uh, of course, are worthless pieces of paper. Right? What the money gives the money value is our social agreement to take it as a token for the promise of goods. If you have chickens and you're a chicken farmer, um, you can't get everything you need with chickens because some people don't need chickens. And in the past, you would have had to trade your chickens for wood and then trade your wood to somebody who had flour. But money is like a promissory note that allows you to trade a particular value in whatever goods you might have for whatever other goods or services you might have. So money is just a very flexible way of making those trades. And of course, our money would be completely worthless if uh, we didn't keep those promises. And if we decide in some sense whether to keep those promises and how to distribute them every year as our perishable goods wear out. At one time, money was based upon a gold standard where you could trade in your money for a certain amount of gold to help give confidence in that promise or agreement. But that's long ago been abandoned, and now there's nothing but the good trust of social order and the government to keep our confidence in the idea that our little paper items and our little ledgers in our bank accounts on our phone mean something in some goods or services that we can purchase. So Shaw considers various different ways of distributing those goods. He considers communism the version of Saint Benedict and of the Gospels. But he says that's only good for goods that are used by all. So we're communists about our roads and our army and other things that we all benefit from, and therefore we're all willing to pay taxes for. So oftentimes people note that all of us are socialists or communists about certain social goods that we agree ought to be provided by the government and that we all ought to share in common, both their costs and their benefits. But he recognizes that you can only do that for things that we all agree are goods for everyone. He considers a series of other possibilities, that you only get what you produce, you only get what you deserve, that there ought to be a small group of people who can collect capital, who are better at producing good and beautiful things and better at preserving a system. And he rejects each of those, suggesting that it's only an equal distribution of labor and an equal distribution of goods and of wealth based upon that labor, which is the best alternative. And we'll look at Marx's arguments for a form of socialism next time. But the contemporary meanings of socialism and communism stem from Karl Marx and his Russian followers, Lenin and Stalin. Marx was a sociologist who gave sort of an economic history of different economic systems. And he thought that socialism meant social ownership of the means of production, social ownership of capital, that you don't allow private individuals to accumulate capital that businesses need to build factories and produce the means of production. You have a centralized bank controlled by the government or controlled in common by the people. And he would say that socialism would eventually develop um, in its ultimate historical development to what he called communism, which was a withering away of the state, where people lived in common without competition, without crime, without any need for police or any regulation by a state at all. But that was the ultimate destiny of human beings. And of course, in that sense, no government has ever been communist in that sense. It never sort of found that there was no need for any government whatsoever, apart from little utopian communes, perhaps somewhere. So for Marx, socialism generally means social ownership of the means of production. Um, and the way that we use the word communism now comes from some of Marx's followers who tried to apply his theories to Russia, which was not an industrial country at all, was still an agrarian country, only recently having freed its slaves or serfs. Um, and they thought that before you could even reach a socialist state, we first of all had to re educate the people and reprogram them to get them out of their old ways. So Lenin and Stalin called for a dictatorship of the proletariat. Proletariat is the working class. And there would have been a small working class opposed to the peasants and farmers in Russia. And they would seize control of the government and control not only all of the economic workings of the country, its banks and its industrial plans, but also all of its culture and education and programming to try to train people out of their old bourgeois or materialist or capitalist ideas, which were preventing them from being capable of sharing their goods and benefits and burdens in common. And of course, that was adopted. Stalin's version of communism was adopted by Mao Zedong and the originators of Chinese communism as well. So when we think of communism, and when it's used in political and ethical debates today as a bad thing, it's because it's referring to the drastic authoritarian control that Lenin and Stalin applied during the dictatorship of the proletariat and the ineffectiveness of the tight government control and planning of the economy. So that's why communism is often used as an epithet, which means people disagree with something. Now, though, today, you can see there are very few countries that even call themselves communist anymore. China still has a communist country, communist party, but it's become a capitalist nation that no longer has um, government ownership of the means of production. You can own private property in China. Um, and you can see that there are a number of other countries that are in some way or other socialist, have governmental control over the means of production in some way or other, or else ruled by, at the current time, a socialist government. Um, Sometimes people use the word socialist just to mean any country that has protections against pure um, capitalism of the type that we mentioned, powerful antitrust legislation, powerful protections of unions, powerful regulation of capitalist interests. And sometimes people just use it to describe countries that have more common goods that are communistic than we do, where we just have roads and the military and libraries and things paid for in common. Some countries have healthcare and retirement and vacation care and childcare as common goods that are paid for in common and used in common. So the word socialism is used, and sometimes even communism is used very inconsistently. Of course, we don't need to know all of that sociology and history, but we should just be aware that calling something socialist or calling something communist isn't really an argument, and especially not if you're not exactly clear which of these various different meanings we've talked about you're actually talking about. So, in the next lecture, we'll look at Marx's argument for a form of socialism.